So in the previous video, I walked you through some of the interpretation questions that I would ask related to the repetition of the word appeal. In this case, it's appeal and appealing. So now I'm going to walk you through the process of how I would respond to some of those questions. I'm not going to try to respond to all of them. First of all, I wouldn't choose to anyway if I were doing this study on my own. We ask a lot of questions, but then we don't respond to all of them because we discern after we ask them all and start looking at them as a whole, we discern that we don't need to pursue all of them to get at what the meaning would have been for the original readers, listeners, hearers. Okay, uh, and sometimes we just don't have time, so we have to kind of pick which ones are worth pursuing. Now, a lot of times I ask in the interpretation bombardment phase, brainstorming phase, why Paul doesn't use X instead of Y. So I ask it sort of from a negative perspective. I don't mean in a negative light, but you see what I'm saying. Why not use a different word? In this particular case, though, instead of focusing on what other words he might have used, I want to focus more on the word that he did use, okay? So that's what we're going to do now. So the first question I want to deal with, remember one of my brainstorming questions was, well, is this word translated, is the Greek word translated the same way in all English translations of the Bible? Now, I didn't look up every English translation that's available in the Bible because there are a whole lot of them, but I looked up 5 other than NRSV. The NIV translates it as appeal, and so does the ESV, that's English Standard Version, and the CEB, that's Common English Bible. But the American Standard Version translates it as beseech, and the King James Version translates it as beseech. Now, if we were going to do a real significant work in this particular question, we would simply want to look up as many English translations as we could find. And there are different resources for doing this, either physical Bibles that you have around, or if you know how to use certain internet-based resources or resources that are loaded on the hard drive of your computer, you could do it that way. For instance, I have eSword on my computer, but I also use Bible Hub on the internet, and sometimes I use Bible Gateway. Uh, um, I'm sort of new to doing this on the computer. I just really like having Bibles in my hand. So I've used eSword more than the other two. I've used Bible Gateway mostly for listening to audio in Spanish, but I've heard really good reports from my friends about Bible Hub. So I would say if you're going to start with one, I would say start with Bible Hub and see how that works for you. So anyway, in other English translations, this Greek word, English translations that I looked at, this Greek word is translated either as appeal or beseech. Now, what is the Greek word? Well, the Greek word that is used here is, or at least the first Greek word, I appeal, not the one I appealing in the gerund form, is parakilo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but parakilo, it's spelled this way. P-A-R-A-K-A-L-O, parakilo. So one of the questions I asked in my brainstorming questions is, does Paul use this Greek word in any of his other writings? And if so, how is it translated, and in what context do you find it? And yes, he does. In Romans 12:1. Now, all of this is from the NRSV. In Romans 12:1, he says, I appeal to you, therefore, so here it's appeal, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And then again in Romans, in 15:30, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit. That's an interesting phrase, the love of the Spirit instead of power or guidance, to join me in earnest prayer to God on my behalf. So in these two uses of Paul, the NRSV anyway translates it as appeal. Again in Romans 16:17, I urge you, brothers. So it's translated differently this time. I urge you, brothers and sisters, to keep an eye on those who cause dissensions and offenses in opposition to the teaching that you have learned. Avoid them. So this would teach us, this would cause me anyway, I won't speak for you, this will cause me to say, wonder what the translator saw in this context that made him wanted to use the word urge as opposed to the word appeal. And if we use the word urge in Philemon, the word in English urge, to translate the same Greek word, wonder how that would read. I urge you on I am urging you on Onesimus's behalf. Does that change the meaning at all in our ears? It wouldn't have changed the meaning for the original listeners because they're listening to the same Greek word. But does it change anything we might understand? Okay. Then in 1 Corinthians, Paul uses this word again. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same purpose. 1 Corinthians 4:16. I appeal to you then, be imitators of me. 2 Corinthians 2:8. So I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. 2 Corinthians 10:1. I myself, Paul, appeal to you based by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. There's a little thing on my screen that shows me the time of the video, and it keeps blocking the lower part of these sheets. Three more from Paul. Ephesians 4:1. I therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you, that's interesting, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Now, I do want to tell you that in Spanish, the word that is in the Spanish translation I use, the word that is used in Spanish to translate this word that Paul uses in the book of Philemon it can be translated in Spanish from Spanish to English to mean beg. It can also mean plead. It can mean pray. It can mean beseech, urge, but it can also mean beg. Okay, so this is based on my Spanish experience, this is an appropriate use of that word. So how would that change the feeling in Philemon if we said, I am begging you on Onesimus's behalf? Would that help us any in understanding what Paul is trying to communicate to Philemon and Apphia and Archippus and the church that meets in Philemon's house? Then urge is once again translated here in Philippians 4:2. I urge you, I don't know how to pronounce her name. I'm going to call her Evelyn. I urge Evelyn and I urge Sally to be of the same mind in the Lord. And then in 1 Timothy 2:1, again, it's urge. First of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. You know, I'm coming back in another video to finish this. I don't want the videos to get too long for your sake or for mine. So I'll see you in the next video.